So part of the reason that I had reached out to have another conversation was, well, the original thing was hearing about like crystals and antennas and connective tissue and teeth and pineal glands, and I remember hearing things like water, like frozen crystals being in the body as well. And I was trying to find that on the interwebs, and I'm like, I can't see anything about that.
Well, you wouldn't.
Is that
Frozen crystals?
okay?
I don't know.
Good.
I think you're living in a little Aaron fantasy
I remember hearing
translation.
somebody say something like that. I was like, could that be a thing? It doesn't make any sense that that's possible.
No, frozen crystals. No, I don't know where.
All right. All right. Well,
that sounds like you might have been translating my stating that we'll go from slippery to gummy, or even gluey, I would say now, from slippery to gluey to crystalline in the tissues. Yeah, with the Maillard effect happening. I got that from Robert Schleit.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, no, there was at one point I heard in a place it seemed reasonable that there was like some frozen bits that like melt upon. Anyways, not that.
Not temperature frozen, but maybe movement frozen.
Yeah, maybe it was some metaphor that I was just too literal that day. But so the crystal part of or connective tissue, I'm curious where memory exists in the body. So it's really hard to define memory being like one specific part of the brain, or maybe you get, it seems like somewhat of a fractal. Bells and whistles are fine. It seems like it's a fractal distributed throughout the whole system, and perhaps maybe, I don't know if you got weird enough, maybe even outside of like this specific skin bag body.
I think that's very legitimate.
But then so where it gets scientifically relevant, outside of people having like cathartic releases from someone digging an elbow into their hips or their abdomen or something, but would be organ transplant memories. So you get the heart or something, some organ from somebody else, and suddenly you have an affinity towards baseball.
Yeah.
Or you kind of start having these reoccurring memories of someone else's past. It's like someone else is in you.
Yeah.
And I just wonder, what do you think about all that?
Well, I know that phenomenon is for real, and anyone in the transplant business knows it. And so then the question is, what is that? And there are people like Michelle Small Wright who talk about geopathic zones as like the energy matrices that form when we live in a place and make our own impression upon it. Now, I can't imagine a place we live more intimately than in our bodies. And so we might say that the garden of our bodies, in her terms, would then form a geopathic zone. And if you were to take some of it and put it somewhere else, it would be like transplanting a pattern which maybe could be read by the new system. But also, I mean, someone like one of my favorite teachers, Stylianos Ateshlis, or also known as Daskalos, would say something like, pain, it's not in your nerve. It's not in your nerves. It's in your feeling giving ether, right? So there are plenty of teachers who would place these kind of experiences, whether pain or memory of pain, or outside of our physicality, and the physicality then would only be maybe a trigger or echo of a more energetic phenomenon that we tend not to pay so much attention to because we're too busy staring at the footprints and missing Bigfoot altogether.
So how's your relationship to pain evolved over the years?
I think we talked about this once before, which is that I have a pretty intimate relationship to pain. And I'd say what has evolved is that, I still have some pretty impressive pain in my life. And what's maybe evolved is my emotional relationship to it. Because for the longest time, I was just collapsed by it. And then I was like, oh, well, you can actually take some charge out of pain, because part of pain is the charge surrounding the fact that you're in pain, the emotional charge around it. So you can kind of go into a very non-emotional place, and as a way to ride out the pain rather than exacerbating it, if it's not something that's being diminished by whatever strategies you're using. And so you can kind of get a little get a little zen about your pain. But those people who say things like, oh, pain and pleasure, they're just all the same and blah, blah, blah. I'm like, bullshit. No, I'll take an orgasm over a migraine any day, you know, like, and I've never turned one into the other. And I've tried, trust me, I've tried everything. I have whacked my way through a migraine and gotten nowhere with that. You know, maybe there are more esoteric techniques, but you know, actually, my headaches aren't migraines; they're cluster headaches, and that's kind of the ugly cousin of migraines. But people never heard of those, so I talk about migraines. But
something that I find interesting is how, and I want to keep kind of poking around at pain a little bit, but how our postural patterns, the way that we like hold ourselves in daily life, I feel like it's like an outward expression of an inner story.
Absolutely.
You know, so I know that I know you've gone through various different iterations of that, being like monk-like, you know, and kind of getting the memo that is the path towards maybe liberation was your mindset at that time, you know, or maybe like you go into like a gym, Gold's Gym, you gotta have like a swole archetype, you know, and extend the chest, which is essentially just like a virtue signaling, peacocking type thing. And so there's nothing that's right or wrong about any of that. It's just, they're just tools. But
they're expressions.
But then being able to parse out and differentiate, like, what is the tool and what am I, and am I able to be able to freely flip through those various different pages, or am I kind of, you know, stuck? And then when you do get proverbially stuck in that page or that postural expression, then it does become you. It's kind of like the mask, like Jim Carrey.
Oh yeah.
And then it reaffirms itself, and then you're like, well, what else could possibly be?
Yeah, method acting is dangerous. Now
and effective.
And effective. We believe it because it's real at a level. But someone like Carlos Castaneda's stories about, you know, being assigned to go to a place by Don Juan and hang out with some old man in some cottage somewhere out in the desert. And then after 2 weeks, you know, some dude comes prancing in and he's like, who are you? And he's like, what do you mean, who am I? I've been with you all along. Because he was, you know, playing an old man, right? You know, assuming that posture. And the posture comes with it a system of belief on the part of people who witness it about what they're seeing. And so we can then have our own self confirmed by our environment. You know, if you walk around like an old man, everyone will treat you like one. Yep. And I, you know, Rachel and I will be walking along and she'll be like, posture B, you know, because like I'll be in posture A, which is, you know, burdened by the world, suffering, long suffering, you know, contracted posture. And then posture B is just like letting that shit go and being, you know, in my fullness. And the thing is, you know, as surely as we can, I know I can switch back and forth between the two at the drop of a hat. I can also forget to switch and remain in posture A for a long period of time. You know, I'm not talking hours, I'm talking months.
Yeah. And it comes into a question that I've had, because I think I've historically kind of been banging at the idea that we need to move more. We're like, you know, culture of sedentarism, and that's a big problem. But then there's also, it's like, well, it's not really just there's nothing wrong with resting. You know, if you go to a hunter-gatherer tribe, which I've never really been to one, but I've read about them, they, on average, at least the Hadza specifically, will be in resting positions for 9 to 10 hours a day.
Wow.
You know, so it's
clearly no internet there.
Yeah, right. Well, they're doing stuff. They're like resting and doing stuff. They're not just sitting aimlessly doing nothing, like staring into a phone. Maybe at this point, maybe some more. But they're, you know, they're kneeling and they're, you know, crossing their legs. They essentially look like, you know, kids. Like kids will squat and kneel and you know, go through those various different positions. But the idea of movement, I think, is also a subjective term. And, you know, if you sit for a while, like I'm sure you've had some experience with extended meditations, there could be a lot of movement in just stillness. And so I wonder if your perception of the term or the concept of movement, like how does that strike you? What is movement? And we don't need to be excessively, you know, deep or philosophical or metaphysical, or we can, or whatever.
Well, I kind of like, don't tear a page out of Barral's book, Jean-Pierre Barral, and he talks about, you know, mobility and motility, specifically of the organs, but I think we can apply that to life in general, where, you know, the mobility of the organ is literally its transit through space. So the kidneys going up and down in response to the filling of the lungs, you know, or the liver rolling forward towards the navel. That's its mobility. And then its motility is kind of its intrinsic inner life, where the liver is processing chemicals and blood is moving through it and out of the fenestrated capillaries over the parenchyma of the liver, and then processes are happening, and all that is movement too. But it's maybe that movement that you describe happens when you're in meditation. Maybe when we're in meditation or something, we're experiencing the motility of the being, and rather than necessarily the get up and go mobility.
Yeah, and also the unbinding of previously what seemed to be, you know, dehydrated, agglomerated, stuck, rigid, you know, all the words, joints or tissue, as a product of just being seemingly still.
Yeah,
it's very, you know, it's interesting.
Well, because if you're dissolving beliefs, you know, if you're dissolving, you know, thought patterns, those are the primary movers or freezers, not in a temperature sense, but in a movement sense. the primary movers and stillness inducers of our tissues.
Yeah.
Right? Because if you don't want something, you're not going to try and go get it. And that's the basis of all movement, right? Is desire. And I think, and life, you know, there's some combination of desire and life. Now, life moves you too, not necessarily in the way that you desire, but some play between those two is always, to my mind, the primary mover.
Yeah. Do you think that there's an inherent friction in the way that the modern humans, as a generalized like whole, exist in their minds and their bodies? Do you think that culturally?
We're at odds. We're at odds rather than at rhythms with ourselves. You know, we're in like a constant battle between the time and place personality and homeostasis, which is like the soul, you know, that committed to embody. And then we literally fight it from day one, like just going with the flow of life. We're so resistant that we actually, you know, canalize our bloodstream and build crusty canals inside of ourselves, and in an attempt to restore the body and keep it on the planet longer, you know, instead of just, you know, undulating with the inner jellyfish and moving through life and letting the spirit blow where it will.
Why do you think that is? What's because I wonder, I question sometimes, even when something, you know, really what seemingly on the face seems quite terrible, I always wonder what like the higher intelligence of that is, or what's like is there some all-knowing intelligence that's kind of driving the whole? And if someone is a greedy asshole, or someone feels the need to conquer some land from a 30,000 foot view, there's some semblance of sense or reasoning to it.
Absolutely. That's spoken to just in our own bodies. It's just a perspective. In other words, right now there are cells being dismembered and apoptosed and taken apart and run through the spleen to be recycled into something else. And we're not miffed about it. We're not sad that cells are sloughing off and dying, and they're, cataclysms happening within our form constantly in order to, keep the life process going. If we stopped all that and said, oh no, we have to save every red blood cell from
Right.
from ever dying or something like that. We need to increase its lifespan. It'd be like ridiculous. Why? Some live short, some live long. They're doing their job. But so big picture on Earth, it's a big organism that's cycling through, and so just perspective. I mean, you might think God is cold because the death is allowed on the planet, but the perspective, like you said, at 30,000 feet isn't so dark.
So I wonder, because you have a background in theology and ethics and things of the sort. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
You go to school for that. So I wonder, a question that I ask a lot to other folks and myself is, one, the utility of shame and the origin of shame. Because you can see shame, something that pops up around, whatever, maybe age 4 or 5. You need to be a part of a culture, and people need to kind of tell you what's right or wrong for you to even have enough theory of mind or awareness to have a sense of like what could there possibly be to be ashamed of. And then the potential of leveraging that shame for someone else's, garnering power for someone else. That comes into like the whole puritanical conversation, or so I wonder. I feel like you've stewed on that idea.
I've stewed in my shame for decades.
Yeah, me too, man.
But I'm
ashamed.
That's neurosis, though, right? In other words, shame. Like shame and guilt, I like to say, are pretenders to the throne of responsibility. So, you can lie around guilty and ashamed, or you can make a judgment about whether whatever boundary you cross for which you're experiencing shame is a legitimate one. In which case, the shame is useful because it's marking the territory of a legitimate boundary. Or you might find that shame and guilt is just a phantasm, and that if you took responsibility for having crossed such a boundary or another, and said, "Yeah, I crossed that. I did it mindfully. I did it on purpose, and I'm good to go," then there's no shame.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it seems like shame in the body, say like a common one would be around, like sexual organs.
Yeah.
Your penis is too small or too big or too circumcised or too uncircumcised, or your vagina's, like whatever the thing is.
Yeah, it's got the wrong.
You have an anus.
Labial shape or something. Or it doesn't look like a 12-year-old. It's terrible what we do to ourselves. Our body shame is incredible. I'm not sure that's. I'm not that among shames. I would say that's one of the least legitimate ones. That's an imposition, I would say. Now, how you use your body, that's a whole another thing. That can get a little sketchier because that's going to be in a relationship. But as far as I'm concerned, your body is a gift. It's good. It was given to you. You didn't ask for it, and so it's a gift. And if the powers of the universe have sought fit to give you that gift, then there could be nothing ill or untoward about it. From stem to stern. And that's something that I've learned in my own growth as a person relative to my upbringing as a devout Catholic, Roman Catholic upbringing, where the symbolism and the whole movement pattern of the culture I was raised in was very limited and body negative. And I abjure all of that at this point.
And how does shame show up in the body? What's like the materialized form of shame?
Yeah, so many ways. But I mean, just look at if you just watched my pelvis moving through space, 25 or 30 years ago, you'd be like, that it was like the very definition of shame, or the stillness and the holding. Of my whole body. God forbid that I should feel something good running through it. And if I did, that it was shameful. So it's a very internalized thing where pleasure itself is cause for shame. Right. And so that's a pain supporting culture, right? Where no one will shame you for being in pain, but they will shame you for being in pleasure. You'll shame yourself. You internalize that because the message, in other words, when you have a suffering God crucified on a cross, that's salvific, right? Then pain is an elevated status. It's sanctified, actually. And so any feint or movement towards pleasure is seen as hedonism, even if it only amounts to leaving pain behind. Right. And so that is an imbalance, a tragically imbalanced thing that results in certain kinds of posture and movement and self-limitation and truncation of pleasure that's native to the body, that's native to the gift.
Yeah, it's weird. It's like a Stockholm syndrome.
Yeah.
Of sorts.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
But then, so with the Stockholm syndrome, there's like a captor,
Mm-hmm.
and that's the thing that I always like. Anytime someone says they or them, or like the deep state, or like, and I'm kind of like, what, who exactly are you referring to? And I wonder if maybe ultimately, if you turn that back, it's like maybe it's yourself. Maybe it's like who is the captor?
Yeah, it's always. You're the savior and the perpetrator and the victim all together. When you step out of the tiny little person and you realize you're playing all the roles, and you can say, well, I don't want to play any of those roles. What else is there besides playing the role of savior, perpetrator, and victim?
Yeah,
because we swap out between those three all day long.
Yeah, it seems like it could be, for me at least, it could be terrifying or at least uncomfortable to relax, because the belief is that if you do allow that spaciousness or ease or just a sensation of safety, because that's at some deeper level, maybe at certain, if there's there's different like layers of the human, maybe the top 5 layers or whatever model you have, like they're kind of good, but if you get in maybe layer 2, there's a contraction there. And a person never got the permission or the safety or the container to be held and supported in that place to actually feel resourced enough to relax. And that comes into manual therapy. Sometimes if someone's holding some pattern, both of us have a background with Rolfing, structural integration, and things of that sort. Sometimes you can take them deeper into that pattern, and actually hold it even shorter than what they're accustomed to, and just hold it for them. And suddenly their nervous system does some unwinding mechanism of some sort that you could probably explain better than I could, to allow them to actually create space or want to create space in that place. Yeah,
it's like a nervous system reset, because the whole system is hypertonic, in a kind of in a shocky, permanent way. And I can say for myself, I don't know, maybe it was, I think I rested for the first time in 2017 in a park in LA on mushrooms. And I didn't take a lot of mushrooms. It was a day off from my headaches, and I had heard that psilocybin could help cluster headache sufferers. And so I gave it a shot, and I found myself just lying in the grass in a park with my friend, and who was kind of my guardian for the experience. And I was so moved, at an emotional level by what I was experiencing, which I instantly identified as rest. And I couldn't remember feeling that. And it was overwhelmingly emotional to experience rest. Not for 9 hours a day, like a Hansa tribesman, but like literally for a half an hour in 30 years or something, right? Or 40, or longer, to just like, oh my God, this is what rest feels like. I'd forgotten, from my state of hypervigilant, anxious, pained, shamed beingness. I think that's sickening, literally. I think we injure ourselves with those states, or those states represent a kind of, kind of place that's not comfortable, that's not the right word, but normal for us. And then our culture kind of feeds us that incessantly, because you can get more taxes out of restless people than restful people.
Do you think it matters having a definition of the origination of the like inciting trauma or contraction?
I mean, not to put psychology aside, I think there's a lot of ways to enter the circle, but I don't think you necessarily have to put words on it to have a shift. Not really. Now, that having been said, sometimes we can identify momentous events in our lives, whether they be, experience, whatever the experience. It might have been an aha moment that was a mistake. We're like, oh, I realize that I'm a piece of shit. And then you move on from there for the rest of your life. Like, that's a mistake. It's not true. But we can still orient ourselves that way. And maybe realizing, no, I'm actually good in an essential way, can transform that attitude. And like a strong medicine can induce a habit. It can, induce a habit of rest in a system that's been made anxious for whatever reason. But I don't think you actually have to know to make progress. I don't know. Maybe a psychologist would argue with that, or maybe someone who's doing kind of therapy where we're looking for the primary lesion, say, in maybe osteopathic techniques or something, where you can tinker with all the things around the primary lesion all day long, but once you touch that one point that's like the seed, then all the branches from that seed are then adjusted. And I know there are chiropractors who just work on the atlas, and so there are folks who do take it on that way. And so whether it be a psychologist pinpointing the moment when your mother said X, Y, or Z, or when the bully pushed you on the playground and changed something in you, or when you got hit by a train or whatever, or maybe the physical practitioner who finds that primary lesion. I'm not wanting to say that's not super amazing, because miracles come from those moments. But I'm also not necessarily thinking you have to be on a quest to find that thing, or else you can't be well. I think that's a mistake too, because you can actually drop it all just from believing that you can and make very quick progress. Go to a Joe Dispenza a week, and people are like dropping paralysis, and things without actually having to know why or how, because they are consciously and intentionally resetting themselves. Mushrooms can do it, but also an intention can do it. You don't need mushrooms either. In other words, you don't need anything, because you're already meaningful. I think our nature is that we're meaningful beings, and that those meanings can be, you can mistake the meanings, but when you get to the actual meaning of our being, it's so loving and good that we stop worrying so much. And you could say to that immediately, like, well, what about all the sociopaths out there? I guess there's plenty of them. And they tend to rise to the top because it's their nature to manipulate the goodness of people towards their ends. There's that too in the whole system. And, it doesn't have to stop us from knowing who we are.
I wonder if there's something to that the general tendency for culture to want to tear down those at the top, that culture ultimately was a part of their rise. Like, do you know what I'm saying? Like, oftentimes when someone, so we're rooting for someone, cheering them along, like, cool, you're amazing, you're the best. Yeah. And then we're waiting to cancel the person.
Oh yeah.
And it feels so good and gratifying to cancel that motherfucker.
We're a cruel mob. I mean, Yeah, I mean, poor.
I wonder if there's some inherent skepticism in the like a tree that grows too high. Like if there's some defense mechanism in there that actually there could be some authenticity to.
Yeah, we tend to kill those who rise to the top,
Yeah.
and the ones that we don't manage to kill are set on killing us. Because only the good ones are killable, and the demons.
Whoa.
The demons are the ones who rule the world, right?
Jeez. What do you think about embryology in relation to the conversation of pain and self-awareness? And you can really dork out on that and come up with some pretty interesting extrapolations of what's going on in the body and the mind and perception.
Yeah,
and
get
such.
me started. You can't ask a question like that without having an idea.
Well, just so in relation to say going back to the origin of the contraction or the fear or the resistance, or is there any value winding all the way back to like a fetus?
I think, I mean, if we take away the judgment about contraction, expansion and contraction is the very pulse of life, right? So we right the friggin' universe is expanding, and folks say at some point it'll collapse or whatever. I don't know if that's true, or if it just expands infinitely. I don't know, but I mean, a cell, an orgasm, either way, they're pulsing. There's what if you had no tension, you'd have no discharge, right? So you can't. Why do we judge the contraction so harshly? It's part of the pulse of life, and it's it can't be avoided. It's like you're in a body and you're sitting in meditation and you're in samadhi and you're expanded and one with the universe and all that. And at some point you're going to piss yourself. You just got to get up and go pee. Your bladder is going to be messing with you. And yeah, there's a couple examples of these people whose like hair grows into the tree behind them and they just become whatever. But that's not really the path for most of us. It's more, I think, to tell you the truth, I think that if you and I were, someone hit us with a magic peacock feather and turned us into, gods of universes, right? We'd be like, oh, damn, I just blew out a tire on my universe there. I wiped out 400 million galaxies this morning by accident. And then you feel a little sad about yourself and think you're not a very good God. And you go talk to your other gods friends at a gods men's group or something. Right.
I'm one of the things I wanted to talk to you about was the difference between working with a cadaver and working with a sentient body.
Mm-hmm.
And as I was a more like polarized question would be, to what degree have we been misled through our study of deceased bodies and two-dimensional images?
We've erred to the degree that we've not paid attention to the fact that we are only interpreters of the footprints and that the footprints are not the beings, right? Yeah. So people do that all the time. I caution against it in my classes. I'm always saying, we have to have an interpretive stance relative to the cadaver, because look around the room, we're all moving, breathing beings, and this thing, this diary, this footprint of a being is just sitting here real still, and so we have to look at what's changed in the colors and the textures and the movement and this being versus this being. There's certain beingness to a cadaver, but it's very different. And I see it. I like this guy. What's his name? He's a New Jersey guy. He's a tracker from the Pine Barrens. Do you know what I'm talking about? Anyway,
no. They're talking about maybe.
Yeah, you type in Google tracking Pine Barrens guy. He teaches like survival workshops and stuff like that. Anyway, very interesting guy. But he looks at a broken twig and and an impression in the dirt on the ground, and he can, he can talk to you about the weight of that animal, what it was doing, what it wanted. And once he figures out what it wanted, he can follow it much easier, right? Because he can want that thing with it and go looking for it. And I feel it's not that different. You don't mistake a deer hoof print for a deer, and you shouldn't mistake a human life's footprint in a dead body for a person. And once you get clear on that, then you're a tracker, and you don't mistake the model for the reality. And yet that hoof print is pointing to a deer. And if you read it right, you'll realize that it's pressed a little harder on its front hoof than it's on the right than on the left. And there might be a reason for that. Maybe it was injured on its right foot, or, maybe it had a burr under its armpit there, right? You start asking questions about it, but, so the model and the leftovers and the tracks can be incredibly valuable pointers that you'll never get to just glancing at the being, because you can look more deeply. If you want to understand the being more deeply, you got to pay attention to the tracks that it leaves. And like, it took me years to figure out that the dry gunk in between the muscle tissues was just a track of a slippery membrane. But now, once you get it, now it's like, oh, now you don't mistake it for something else. You're like, oh, that's pointing towards the movement and the life of that being, as opposed to some pathology. And you learn to read the tracks better over time. And so then the dead become informants on the living rather than deceivers with respect to the beings.
The direction I was potentially allowing my mind to go was could all of the research into these two-dimensional models potentially let us further astray or deeper into like a disassociation from our intrinsic experience?
I think they can, but they don't have to.
Yeah.
Just like Facebook, which sucks, can be used as a tool to lift people up and build community. That's what I try and do with it.
Yeah.
But it can also be this addictive monster that destroys your self-esteem because you didn't get enough likes. It can be that, but it doesn't have to be that. You can use a hammer to hit a nail or to smash someone's brains out. You know what I'm saying? So, in other words, it depends on how you use it. Whether it becomes a tool of horror and mayhem, or a tool of service, like we're building houses after a tornado with the same hammer. Well, that's a beautiful thing. You can't outlaw hammers.
It does piece well into. I think there was like a transition in our zeitgeist of thought into Newtonian mechanics, and so coming into a place of like just mechanistically thinking about things, and overlaying that style of thinking into the human complex, chaotic, highly variable experience.
Yeah.
And kind of having this like trying to fit it in, and if some places where you subconsciously inherently know it doesn't fit, but you just kind of fucking do it anyway.
Yeah. That's the nature of sticking to one model and not having a whole armful of them to work with at the same time. That's dogma, right? So when you're attached to a single model and force everything into it, that's like the nature of dogma and totalitarianism.
Yeah. How has your mind changed in the realm? Like I know one of the things that you've talked about a lot of or you've repented a lot about is the fuzz speech.
Actually, I haven't repented that much.
Okay.
The only part that I repent of is the imagery that I used to support the story.
Right.
Because it's all I had at the time.
Can you talk about that for, I'm sure the vast majority of people, there's probably a percentage of people that are familiar with that, but probably a good
Yeah.
chunk are like, what
Well,
were you talking about? Fuzz?
it's funny because when I did that tour in 2017, I went to like 46 cities trying to explain myself out of that 5-minute speech. um, and I found myself kind of marveling that I agreed with almost everything I said in it. But where it fell down, right, was in the notion that like the imagery that I use, like when I show one side of the shoulder was dissected and one side was not dissected. And it gave the impression that the dissected version of it was clear and as it should be, without fuzz, and that the dissected, that the undissected section had something wrong with it. Well, that was a bad choice of imagery, because then people run away thinking, oh, I need to have like air between my body parts, and that's not true. Also, yeah, that's really my main mea culpa in that, is that imagery was misleading, because in the words, if you follow the words of it, basically I'm saying melt the fuzz. I didn't say dissect the fuzz. I didn't say take your body apart, make things go away. I've gotten letters from people saying, oh, I love your speech. I want to make the fuzz go away. I'm like, no. That's part of your body. That's good stuff. It's actually slippery. And what we're looking at is perifascia that's dried and in tension. So when you put it in tension and pull it apart, then in a dissected, desiccated form, it looks like what I thought I was doing as a rolfer. I thought as a rolfer, I was making stuff like that. I was de-adhesing things. But de-adhesing doesn't mean separating things that are born to live together. De-adhesing really means softening, melting, taking something that's sticky and making it slippery.
Or maybe could you say like potentiating organization?
Yeah.
Would that be a weird thing to say?
No, that'd be a good thing to say. Yeah, like facilitating the body's propensity to differentiate texture and movement, you might say. Because when you kind of lean into something that's agglomerated, the body's like, whoa, gosh, I haven't been here in a long time. I used to actually do shit here. I used to actually move in different ways here, and I haven't moved in different ways here in 10 years. And maybe there's a why that pops up back to memory, right? Maybe it's like, oh gosh, I realize I haven't been here in 10 years because I was afraid of this place because it hurt due to an event, and so I withdrew from here, and that withdrawal resulted in a demagnifying of my slipperiness rather than a magnifying of my slipperiness and differential movement there. So if a rolfer or a body worker is doing anything, it's facilitating this differential movement where I was lost. But differential movement doesn't mean the separation of tissues. Differential movement means the reestablishment of the interfaces between the tissues that are born to slip rather than stick.
So is agglomeration and the fuzz video, for people that don't know, it's on YouTube. You probably just look up fuzz speech, Gil Hedley, I'd imagine.
Yeah, that'll do it.
That'll do it.
It'll get you to some other people who've stolen it too.
oh, good.
Watch mine.
Yeah, and so
I need the likes to feel good.
Exactly. Yeah, love validation. The agglomeration, would that be like a form of bracing in the body? And can you define what agglomeration means?
Well, it could be that. So it could be bracing in a sense of like scar tissue formation to hold things together that have been broken apart somehow in an injury. But agglomeration can also just mean that place where stasis and inflammation has resulted in the body believing that it needs to be held together. So we have an inherent healer in our body. It's like the doctor within, right? So that if our skin is torn open, it'll knit back together, whether the tear be internal or external. We have this internal propensity to rebind tissues that have been injured. Now, the advantage of having like a doctor on retainer inside of our body, right, should be obvious, right? Because we do get injured and we need this incredible self-healing power. the downside of it, though, is that if without being injured, we act like we're injured, right? By holding ourselves and not moving or inducing injury through the kind of foods we ingest or the kind of beliefs that we hold or the kind of movement that we do or don't do. All of that can result in recruiting that healer to bind our tissues together, right? When that would not be, that is not optimal, right? So I like to say we're like sharks, that we have to keep moving to maintain our system, because when we stop, our internal doctor believes that's a signal to bind us. So I'll stand by my testament, which is we got to keep moving. And the thing is, though, if I believe myself to be, a good pious Catholic young man, I'm going to move in a certain way, and certain things will be allowed to move and other things will not be allowed to move. And whatever that balance is in me will become my slippery areas versus my sticky areas. Right. And maybe I believe something else about myself. Maybe I believe that I'm a great samba dancer, and that will result in a completely different organization of my tissues. Maybe I think I'm a great golfer, and I develop my swing over and over again, and I keep doing this thing. And most of us create a pattern when we're golfing that puts it into the next fairway. But every once in a while, you get a person like Tiger Woods who's created a rut in his body that's so deep. The groove is so deep in the way that wins the game that he becomes, a legend in his sport for the rut that he's created in his nervous system to enable that to happen. And he pays a price for that, because for being slippery in that rut, he's got to be still in other places. And I guarantee you he's going to pay for that as an old man. Because if he didn't create that rut, he wouldn't be winning. But also there's a price. Talk to any, NBA basketball player about the price that they pay for, the way that they use their body.
Yeah. And then there are some sports that are intrinsically more dynamic, and golf is very obviously asymmetrical,
right? Yeah,
rut, like
bowling, bowling, golf, tennis are all very ruddy kind of.
But it's not to say that to be an athlete you need to pay a price per se, but to be at the highest level in an asymmetrical sport, there's probably going to be something on the other side of that.
Oh yeah.
Especially if you started at a young age and you specialized too early, and you didn't develop that, that full movement mind body matrix.
Yeah. It's fine though. That's part of the playing with. We're allowed to spend our lives as we wish. Right. Yeah. And so I don't have any condemnation of forming a rut in your body that makes, that enables you to do something that you want to do. If that's how you choose to spend your life, good on you. Excel there. And again, every choice comes with a price, and the price of being very fluid in every which way, like my beautiful friend, Russell Malafont, who's an unbelievable dancer, modern dancer in England, choreographer. Russell is the most fluid human I've ever known, but he'd probably suck at golf.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So I wonder, within the internally connective tissue binding, agglomerating, becoming, dehydrated, is there some kind of piezoelectric thing going on there? Is there how does one describe at the deeper level how that structure exactly manifests?
Yeah. So, for instance, you have elastin, right? Elastin is one of the slippery components of connective tissue because of its array of electrons, that surround it and create like a buffer. Or is it protons?
Electrons are surrounding the atom.
one, one of the, I'm talking about the molecule, like an elastin. So just picture a little string with like a little cloud, like a little aura around it, a little energy aura. And because of that energy aura, it doesn't stick to anything. And consequently, the effect on the tissues is that it gives it a slipperiness, right? But if there's inflammation, the very nature of inflammation is a pool of protons, right? From hydrogen. So you end up binding the elastin and reducing the slipperiness. This is my very limited understanding of this, but that basically it is an electrical phenomenon, at that level, or a chemical phenomenon, you might call it, which is just a bunch of positives and negatives messing with each other, right? So at that level, the sticking is hydrogen bonding, and cross-linking of fibers that would otherwise not be cross-linked or bound to one another. And then how do you unbind them? How do you get that pool of protons out of there? That's de-inflammation, is to drain the pool of protons from the inflamed area. So, well, that's what the Earth is for, right? So the Earth is a giant, at its surface, a giant pool of electrons from lightning strikes all day long, every day, all over the planet, right? We're just like, there's this little blue marble floating through space, and it's like touching doorknobs all day long. And that generates a pool of electrons on the surface of the Earth, which we've detached ourselves from with our brilliant footwear. And consequently, just knocked my earphones out in the excitement of it all. Yeah. So if we make contact with that pool of electrons, it can literally crawl up into our bodies through our connective tissue, drain the points of inflammation by, counteracting the proton pool.
That's cool. So the piezoelectric stuff, that's like...
Well, piezoelectricity is a little different from what I just described.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So that's what I'm curious about, because if you put pressure on your butt, you're sending you're creating like an electrical, I'm probably butchering all this, so I apologize in advance, but you're essentially creating like electrical stimulus, a charge around those bones.
It's like
I'm probably saying it wrong already, right?
No, just think of it. No, it's good. So pressure electricity, piezoelectricity, this all means pressure electricity. So when you distort the connective tissue fabric, it produces a field, and that field is the signature of the distortion at an electrical level. So that's kind of cool. And so it's like, I think about every breath that we breathe, right, as a distorting of the pleura and the peritoneum, right? So we have these connective tissue sacs that are piezoelectric fabrics that every breath distorts. And so the character of each breath has a signature, a field signature that's generated and read, I would believe, by the whole body. We know how we're doing all the time with respect to breath, or with respect to our pulse going down the connective tissue sleeves of our vasculature, or whether it be a pressure wave, a solenoid wave generated in the brain and moving down the neural sheath like a wave of pressure electricity signals. Some people believe that that's actually the action potential of a nerve rather than the chemical exchange, that it's actually a pressure wave going down the axon. That's what's being measured when we say that's the action potential. They're saying, no, actually you're measuring the piezoelectric wave going through the nerve generated by the brain. So I think it's then whatever distortions we place on ourselves through our attempt to relate to our culture and our family and our social circumstances, right? Our pressures, in addition to gravity upon our system, and much more devastating than gravity, because we have levity within us to lift us up, right? The disposition of the organs relative to one another actually result in lift rather than sinking, right? That's why that's the marvel of the biped is we stack our organs on top of each other and feel like we're floating in the air. It's a great feeling. And Ralph, who's had a successful session, delivers the stacking of the organs that experiences lift and levity relative to the pressures, right, of everything, the pressure, the social pressure, the pressure of the angry spouse, the pressure of the bills. Right? All those pressures are distorting our field literally, and our tissues are suffering accordingly and sticking accordingly.
Yeah. So I'm just trying to paint for my own understanding, like what the hell is happening in the body. So there's a charge. I'm going back to my crude nonsense. There's a charge in the area, and I just think it's such an interesting thing that we're continually engineering ourselves through electricity and probably lots of other things. And so then it sends the signal to these cells that we call fibroclast or fibroblast or osteoclast or blast, and they're like the chewers or the builders.
Yeah.
So you have these little engineering cells that they're gathering the information that is that you deliver to them with the schematics of your life.
Yeah.
And they come in and they either, they stop chewing or they, to allow a little bit more of a buildup in certain areas. And it's just such an interesting thing that we're all a bunch of we're like a marble statue, except like a sentient statue. And we have these artists living inside of us, or we are the art. It's very interesting.
I love it. I love it. And the good news from that, from that description is how malleable the thing is. How plastic the systems are and potentially responsive to altered patterns. But you can't expect to get a different result from the same thoughts, emotions, or behaviors. And I think like that brings it to ethics for me. I mean, Thomas Aquinas was like, a habit, isn't induced from a single act, but from the repetition of acts right? And so we repeat acts all the time. We are incredibly redundant. we think the same things over and over and over again. And then we reinforce those patterns and they actually become meat and flesh and shape. They take shape in space. And you can think other things. In other words, people think they're a victim all the time. It's like, think something else. You literally can choose what you think. And people will be like, well, that's how I feel. I can't help how I feel. Actually, you can help how you feel. You can think something else and you'll feel differently. So in other words, we get very attached to our emotional reactions to things and defend our emotional reactions to things without ever taking 10 seconds to inspect the constellation of thoughts that generates that belief in your victimhood in that moment, and that prevents you from asserting your own will, authority, and mastery in a given moment to change the situation. We're very attached to our victimhood.
Yeah.
I would know.
Many are.
All of us. I don't think I'm singling folks out here. People say, "But I really am a victim." I've get notes from people like, "How dare you question victimhood? I really am a victim." I'm like, "Well, it may be true that someone attacked you with a bat on a sidewalk and broke your whatever, and yeah, I'm not denying that. But if you have to spend the next 20 years in court proving to everyone around you that you're still a victim, in other words, in that moment you were victimized is true. And then what do you think of yourself after that moment forever? Do you think, okay, that sucked. That was terrible. A terrible thing happened to me. And I don't like the experience at all. and I wouldn't wish it on the devil, and that person was wrong in doing that, and all those things are true. And now how am I going to live my life? Am I going to go forward, or am I going to stop right here?
Yeah. Seems like the victim, the story of victim, one, it's interesting because there's culturally, it seems like there's like a victim worshiping of sorts.
Oh, you know? For sure. Victim constituencies are cultivated by politicians to generate votes.
Yeah. And so I feel like at the individual level, it's like a person that would hang on to that identity. It's like they're looking for leverage. You know, they feel under leveraged. They feel like they don't have traction, you know, in coming from a place of feeling, you know, secure, and then hanging on to that. And then there's the other thing I think of you do get a lot potentially from, no, I had a thought, but yeah, it's a helpful tool for leverage. So to let go of that, oh yeah, it's like if I wasn't a victim, I think for me in my own experience of my own like dabbles with victimhood,
yeah,
I think it's if I wasn't a victim, then I would have to be responsible. And I don't know that I'm prepared to be responsible.
Well, victimhood is associated with innocence in the victim perpetrator savior model of thought, right? Victim is associated with innocence. Perpetrator gets associated with responsibility. So no one wants to be responsible. That means you're at fault in that mentality, right? Whereas in a mentality of self-mastery, responsibility is power. Whereas responsibility is freedom, actually. Yeah. Because the problem with the innocent victim mentality is that you're powerless, you're stuck, right? You're waiting for someone to save you, because if you act, then you become responsible and potentially a perpetrator. You might act wrong, and then you're in trouble or responsible. A whole knot of thoughts that stops people from making progress in their lives. You know, when you can create a different set of associations with the word responsibility, you know, rather than associating responsibility with perpetration, you associate responsibility with freedom, with the power to act, the power to choose, right? And that's a whole new ride, and it's a very exhilarating one. And yet it requires dropping the attachment to the victim perpetrator savior model. You just have to literally drop that as a false trope.
Has there? Well, we can wrap up now. You got to go in the. I know we already went over an hour. How are you with time?
Oh, look at me! I'm just rushing out the door. I love talking to you. It's fun.
Good.
I always have a good time with you.
Good.
Because you're, yeah.
I was curious. You know, so there you hear of. I have the guy's name written down someplace, but there's like a yogi guy or yogi people that can change the temperature of individual fingers, or it's this one side of their palm to like significant temperature change.
Yeah.
You know, and so using their mind, there's lots of different, various different anecdotes of that.
So, wet blanket sitting in the Himalayas in the snow, and steam starts coming off of them.
Yeah. So has there been anything, and then, you know, going back to what I was suggesting previously of like, what is movement? I would say that's certainly movement, at least like thermogenic movement, you know, which ultimately is movement. Has there been any research or conjecture around that in relation to mobilizing tissue or rehydrating connective tissue, or, you know, within the realm of fascia? Or is that like,
I have no clue, but we've got to get ourselves some trained monks to melt perifascia for us, and we could measure it. That would be totally cool. But I think we're all that monk. I think we all are doing it. We all have that superpower. Yeah. Again, that's another thing. Like, oh, they'll save us. They'll teach us how. No, you know how. We all do it. We do it all friggin' day long. You know, we do these things. It's just a matter of, again, taking responsibility for our thoughts, our emotions and the movements that but you have to become conscious of it. You have to know what you're doing. So you can't just suddenly go from 0 to 100. You have to be like, oh, I do that. You got to know where you are.
How does a person start to know where they are?
Well, rather than blaming someone else for the way you're feeling in any given moment, right? You can say, oh, I feel prickly and hot and pretty cranky at the moment. and I wonder what that's about. How interesting. What am I thinking? What do I believe to be true in this moment? Oh, I believe that other person is a douchebag. Clearly, everyone would agree with that. It's like, maybe it's my relationship or my set of beliefs around what's happening here that puts them in that category. And that I'm doing something here too. I'm actually an agent of my experience and not a victim of it. So, okay, if I'm an agent of my experience, then what are my other options here? Because Moshe Feldenkrais said 1 option is tyranny, 2 is a dilemma, and 3 is a choice. So I have to become a conscious option generator in the moment and pick the one that actually isn't so distressing.
Yeah.
And run with that experience over and over again. And it's like, oh, you see patterns. You have to become a pattern tracker, and you observe patterns in your life. And you're like, oh, why does this always happen to me? Like, why? Oh, I'm experiencing the 14th iteration of this in the last 2 years. Where is my responsibility in generating this pattern? Because all I can do is break my patterns. But if I break my patterns, then the whole world is changed. All the nexus of interactions is altered when I'm willing to take responsibility for my agency in a given moment, for my beliefs and feelings in a given moment, which can become choices picked from multiple options that aren't the tyranny of my own structure.
Yeah, it's a great place to wrap this thing up. Thank you so much for doing this again, man.
Woohoo! Every really 3 or 4 years, I get an email.
Yeah, right. It's a time. I really truly appreciate you in general and making time to do this and all the contribution to the world of this conversation and people's health and well-being from not just a physical but also mental, emotional. I think you are an incredibly important human being in this, just in the planet in general. I really appreciate you.
You're very kind. Thank you.
Yeah. So you have, if people want to learn more about this stuff through the lens of actual anatomy, fascia, connective tissue, muscles, all that stuff, where could people go from here?
You can even misspell my name on Google and find me. So GilHedley.com, GilHedley.com, GilHedley.com. Cool. So I have free stuff there. I think I must have how many hours now of free stuff on my site? I think just a ridiculous amount of free stuff if you want to do the Easy Rider free membership, and that'll hold you for a long while. And for those folks who are really wanting to geek out, I have my Explorer subscription now, which in which I included all of my writings, all my books, all my articles, 130 hours so far of very good quality dissection video, plus free credit if you need it for NCTMB or what have you.
Amazing. Well, thank you. I look forward to the next conversation in 1.5 to 2.5 years or whatever. If you have something coming up, I'm always happy to have you on. I really enjoy these conversations.
Me too, man. And thank you.
Thank you all for tuning in. That's it. That's all. Over and out.